Okay, so let's start with the second week, which is general principles of taxation. So we will basically continue the discussion that we have last week. So next slide is according to the definition or according to some theories, it is the power to tax, the power to destroy. So ibig sabihin, pag ikaw daw ay may kapangyarihan na mag-taxation, it is considered as a power to destroy. And in the ruling in Churchill et al. Versus Concepcion, it has been ruled that the power to impose taxes is one so unlimited in force and so searching in extent so that the courts scarcely venture to declare that it is subject to any restriction whatever, except such as in rest the discretion of the authority which exercise it. So no attribute of sovereignty is more pervading and at no point does the power of the sovereign, the power of the government affect more constantly and intimately all the relations of life that through the extraction made under it. And it is notable in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, Chief Justice Marshall laid down the rule that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. So meaning, if the government do have the power to tax, meaning it also has the power to destroy. What does it mean? So meaning if you do not want to pay your taxes, definitely the government can confiscate your business or can levy any property of yours that can be used to pay your outstanding taxes. So yan yung nangyari dun sa Mighty Corporation. Dahil dun sa Mighty Corporation, hindi sila nagbabayad ng tax nila ng tama at dinadaya nila yung tax declaration nila, then the government sequestered the company and penalized them with billions of pesos. Okay, kaya napansin nyo, isa pa rin sa hindi nagbabayad ng buwis noon ay yung Philippine Airlines. Now, when Duterte became president, tinakot niya yung Philippine Airlines that if they do not pay their taxes, the franchise of Philippine Airlines as a flag carrier of the Philippines will be removed from them. And their franchise will also be revoked. Therefore, what happened? Napilitang magbayad ng Philippine Airlines. Okay? Narinig niyo ba ako?
Yes po.
Okay. Next, accordingly to an authority, the above principle is pertained only when there is no power to tax a particular subject and has no relation to a case where such right to tax exists. This quoted the maxim, instead of being regarded as a blanket authority of the unrestrained use of the taxing power for any and all purposes, irrespective of revenue, is more reasonable construed as an epigrammatic statement of politics and economics axiom that since the financial needs of the state or nation may run out of any human calculation, so that the power to meet those needs by taxation must not be limited even though the taxes become burdensome or confiscatory. Okay? To say that the power to tax is the power to destroy is described not the purpose for which the taxing power may be used, but the degree of vigor with which the taxing power may be employed in order to raise the revenue. So ibig sabihin, the reason why sinabi that it is a power to destroy or that the power to tax is the power to destroy is to prevent the running out of finances of the government. Okay, kasi pag nawalan ng pondo ang gobyerno, hihinto ang lahat ng serbisyo natin. Okay, hihinto lahat ng serbisyo na take advantage nating mga citizen sa ating gobyerno. That's the reason why it is very rigorous that the government must impose, okay, this power of taxation because the life of our government is dependent on taxation. Kaya sinasabi, bayad muna bago ka mag-complain. Right? Yung sinasabi na pag may problema ka sa tax, magbayad ka muna, tsaka ka magdemanda sa gobyerno, tsaka ka magdemanda sa korte. Hindi yung magdedemanda ka muna bago ka magbabayad ng buwis. Next. Okay. Constitutional restraint regarding taxation is the power to destroy. While taxation is said to be the power to destroy, it is by no means unlimited. Yan. It is equally correct to postulate that the power to tax is not the power to destroy, while the Supreme Court sits that because of the constitutional restraint placed on taxing power that violate fundamental right. So basically, kung wala tayong fundamental right, the government can tax 100% of your income. Okay? Because that is the concept of the power to destroy, and that is the concept of taxation. That is the power of the government. Now, the Constitution that we have is actually a restraint to the government not to tax 100% of our income. Right? Kaya sinasabi ko dito, sinasabi ko sa inyo na nakaraan, kayang buwisan ng gobyerno 100% ng income nyo, ng income nating lahat. And the Constitution is the one who protects that right. Yung Constitution natin ang nagpapatunay, ang Constitution natin ang nagpoprotekta sa karapatan natin para hindi i-tax ng gobyerno 100% yung ating kita. Okay? In the case of Rojas et al. Versus the CTA or the Court of Tax Appeals, the Supreme Court reminds us that although the power of taxation is somewhat called the power to destroy, in order to maintain the general public's trust and confidence in the government, this power must be used justly and not treacherously. The Supreme Court held that the power of taxation is sometimes called as the power to destroy. Therefore, it should be exercised with caution to minimize injury to the proprietary rights of the taxpayer. It must be exercised fairly, equally, and uniformly, lest the tax collector kills the hen that lays the egg. And in order to maintain the general public's trust and confidence in the government, this power must be used justly and not treacherously. Diba? Sabi nga natin, do not kill, okay, the hen that lays the golden egg. At ano ba yung golden egg dito sa sinasabing desisyon ng Korte Suprema? The golden egg is basically our taxes or our money, our income that we pay to the government. And who is the hen? Unfortunately, tayo yung hen na tinutukoy dito because we are the citizen who produces those taxes. Therefore, the government should not burdensome too much the citizen for its taxes. Okay? Next. The doctrine seeks to describe in an extreme the consequential nature of taxation, and it results implication to it the power to tax must be exercised with caution to minimize injury to the proprietary rights of the taxpayer. So although it is a power to destroy, it must be exercised with caution. Ibig sabihin, hindi basta-bastang whimsically and capriciously the government will impose taxes without justifying a reason, okay? Without justifiable reason. So it should be implemented, okay? The taxation policy should be implemented and also should minimize the injury. Although it is already an injury, but at least to minimize the injury of our citizen who pays the taxes. Kaya minsan mapapansin mo dito, nagagalit yung maraming nagagalit na taxpayer doon sa mga lower strata in life of economic strata in life of other people because most of them are not being taxed by the government. Ang mga kinakain nila is ayuda na binibigay ng gobyerno. Meron pa silang 4Ps. Tapos, halos lahat ng benepisyo na pupunta sa kanila samantalang yung mga nagbabayad ng tax, hindi sila nagkakaroon ng ganong benepisyo. Okay? But again, sabi nga natin sa unang discussion, okay, it is not about the amount that you give to the government, but it is an obligation of you as a citizen to have a modern and to have a civilized society. That is your contribution to the government. Okay? If the tax is lawful and not violative of the inherent and the constitutional limitation, the fact alone that it may destroy an activity or object of taxation will not entirely permit the court to afford any relief. An example of this is, napansin nyo ba yung sports car na pinasagasaan ni Duterte sa mga pison at sa mga backhoe, right? That is somewhat an example of a power to destroy because ayaw nyo magbayad ng tamang tax or ng luxury tax, ayaw nyo siyang bayaran, then the government can destroy that product that you are selling na hindi nyo binayaran ng tax. That is a good example of that. And that cannot even be questioned in court na bakit sinisira yung mga sports car na yon. But hindi pwedeng ibenta na lang, ipa-auction na lang sa publiko para may additional kita ang gobyerno. That is not the case. Okay? Kahit ako nung nakita kong binabako yung sports car, yung Ferrari, napangiwi ako kasi napakamahal nun, di ba? As a car enthusiast, so nung nakita kong binobomba, sinasagasaan yung Ferrari, napapangiwi ako. But that is a prerogative of the government. Next, a subject or object that may not be destroyed by the taxing authority may likewise be taxed. And what is that? So for example, yung inyong mga right to travel, yung karapatan yung bumiyahe, okay? The government can limit your right to travel by not actually limiting you, but actually asking you to pay for travel taxes. And for example, you want to purchase luxury item, the government can also impose taxes on that. Okay? So, power of a judicial review in taxation, the court cannot review the wisdom or advisability or expediency of a tax. Okay? The court's power is limited only to the application and interpretation of the law. Okay, ang sinasabi dito, kahit ang korte mismo, ayaw nilang pakialaman ang tax. Pag may tinatax at umaalma, as much as possible, the court will hands off in the issue of taxation. The only thing that they can do is either if the application of the taxation is interpreted correctly in accordance to law. Okay, hindi nila pwedeng sabihin na, oops, yung taxation na yan ay illegal or that is unlawful because it's already too burdensome to the constituent. Hindi pwedeng sabihin ng korte yon. Ang sasabihin lang ng korte is if that taxation policy is in accordance to the law. That's the reason why nung kinwestiyon nila ang train law when the train law was implemented in the Philippines, amending the National Income Revenue Code, okay? The Supreme Court cannot held that the amendment is unconstitutional. Hindi nila pwedeng sabihin or hindi nila sinabi that the amendment is unconstitutional. Hindi nga nila ginalaw. Dahil ang sinasabi nila ay they cannot review the wisdom and advisability or expediency of the taxing power of the state. Judicial action is limited only to review, okay, when it involves the determination of validity on the tax in relation to the constitutional precepts or provision. Okay? Is the taxing law, okay, in accordance with the Constitution? And lastly, the determination in the appropriate cases of the application of the law. Is that law applicable to the said taxpayer? Right? Yang batas na ba na yan ay applicable doon sa taxpayer na sinisingil ng tax? Yun lang ang pwede nilang i-review. Pero hindi nila pwedeng sabihin na ang tax na sinisingil ng gobyerno is unconstitutional. Next, levy. Okay, some aspect of taxation. Okay, number one is levy. Determination of the person, property, or exercises to be excises to be taxed, the sum or sum to be raised, the due date thereof, and the time and manner of levying and collecting taxes. Strictly speaking, such refers to taxation. Then the second aspect of taxation is what you call collection. Consists of the manner of enforcement of the obligation on the part of those who are taxed. This includes tax payment, or this includes the payment by the taxpayer, and is refers to as the tax administration. Okay? So, levy and collection processes together constitute a tax system. So basically, yan yung ating dinidiscuss ngayon, and that's the reason why I'm discussing it to you, for you to understand the taxing system of our government. The basic principle of a sound tax system. So what we have is, we have the fiscal adequacy. Okay? The sources of tax revenue should coincide with the approximate the need of the government expenditures. Okay, neither an excess nor a deficit of revenue vis-a-vis the need of government would be in keeping with the principle. Okay, ibig sabihin, it should be, okay, the government should collect taxes in accordance to its need. Okay, else pag hindi natin nakuha yung target na yon, 'di ba? Ibig sabihin mangungutang tayo sa ating mangungutang tayo para punan ang pangangailangan ng gobyerno. For now, we have a good fiscal adequacy here in the Philippines. Maganda ang koleksyon natin ng tax, napupunan nito yung ating pangangailangan sa gobyerno. Except when the pandemic hit us. Because when the pandemic hit us, we don't have enough money. Okay, we don't have enough money to purchase for supplies, to pay the doctors, to pay the nurses, to pay the medical frontliners. Wala tayong pera because we did not expect this pandemic to happen. Therefore, nangutang ang gobyerno because wala tayong kakayanang bumili ng mga gamit na yon. Base kung ano yung meron tayo. Hindi nila pwedeng galawin yung mga pera na ni-reserve nila for projects is because they will be charged malversation of public funds because naka-appropriate na yon. Okay, naka-appropriate na yung pondo na yon para doon, so hindi nila pwedeng galawin yon. That's the reason why the government borrowed money elsewhere. Hindi masamang mangutang, hindi kagaya ng pinalalabas ng mga kalaban sa politika nung nanalong presidente. Wala raw ginawa ang gobyerno natin kundi mangutang. Kung hindi nangutang ang gobyerno natin, wala tayong pambili ng vaccine. Wala tayong pambili ng mga equipment to test the virus of COVID. Kailangan ng mangutang ng ating gobyerno para punan yung pangangailangan ng ating bansa. The problem is, maraming ginagamit yung pangungutang na yon para sa kanilang sariling political agenda. Right? So that's the reason why huwag kayong masyadong makikinig doon sa mga tao na banat ng banat sa gobyerno na naninira sa ating gobyerno, mag-conduct din kayo ng sarili nyong research. Okay? Hindi ko sinasabing perfecto ang gobyerno ni Duterte, but at least, 'di ba? Meron tayong before you bash the government, pakinggan niyo muna, subukan niyo muna mag-research. Subukan niyo muna pag-aralan kung bakit kailangan mangutang ng gobyerno. Although may mga pulpul talaga sa gobyerno ni Duterte, but again, not all. Right? Next. Another basic principle of a sound tax system is the administrative feasibility. Tax law should be capable of convenience, just, effective, and administration. Merong nagpo-propose, I think si Greco Bellica. Si Greco Bellica is proposing to have a flat rate tax to all the Filipinos. Kasi currently, ang taxing system natin is progressive. Ibig sabihin, as your income increase, your tax also increase, or your tax rate also increase. Nawala yata ako. Sorry. Share screen. Okay, so the next principle that we have is basically the administrative feasibility. Tax laws should be capable of convenience, just, and effective administration. So basically, there is someone who's proposing that na gawin nating flat rate. Ibig sabihin, regardless of your income, you have a flat rate tax. But that goes against the principle of progressive taxation. Kasi nga sabi sa progressive taxation, as your tax increases, okay, as your tax increases, your rate of paying the tax should also increase. Kasi currently ngayon, ang taxing system natin, if your salary is, or if your income is not greater than 250,000 pesos per year, therefore your tax rate is 0. Wala kang babayarang buwis. But if your tax rate exceeds more than 250,000 pesos but less than 400,000 pesos, then your tax would be appropriately charged with 20% and so on and so forth. Okay? Next. Okay. Theoretical justice, the tax burden should be in a proportion to taxpayers' ability to pay principle, and that is imposed in our 1987 Constitution that requires taxation to be equitable and uniform. Okay? It is that hindi mo pwedeng buwisan ang tao kahit wala siyang pambayad ng buwis. Hindi mo siya pwedeng i-tax kung wala siyang enough na pambayad doon sa kanyang doon sa kanyang buwis. Okay? So that is one of the requirement of taxation. Okay? Next. Okay, so next we will define the classification and distinction of taxes. Okay? So classification of taxes as per subject matter. Okay? Number one, it is personal, capitalization, or poll tax. Okay? Taxes or fixed amount upon all persons of a certain classes within the jurisdiction of the taxing power without regards to the amount of their property, occupants, or business which they may be engaged in. So regardless kung magkano ang kinikita, magkano ang yaman, so it is not something that is proportionate. An example of that is the community tax, or what we also know as the cedula. Right? So nagbabayad ka dyan regardless kung ano yung contribution mo, regardless kung ano yung ari-arian mo. Next is we have what we call the one moment. Okay, Next, we have what we call the property taxes. Okay, taxes on things or property of a certain class within the jurisdiction of the taxing power. When you say real estate tax, ito yung tinatawag nating amilyar. So ang iyong binabayaran ay base sa laki ng iyong ari-ariang lupa at yun yung iyong sinisingil based on classification of taxation as to a subject matter. Next is what we have, the excise taxes. Okay, charges imposed upon the performance of an act, the enjoyment of a privilege, or the engaging of a occupation. Example of this excise tax are income tax, because you are privileged to have an income, therefore you should pay your income tax. Additionally, the value added tax, or also known as the VAT. Okay? You are being taxed because you are privileged to buy something. Ikaw ay may pribilehiyo na magbayad ng something, therefore you have to pay your privilege, your excise tax on VAT. Okay? Yeah, one more. Okay, next. Another example of excise tax is you have your donor's tax. Meaning, if your parents will donate something to you, okay, your parents should pay a donor's tax. Meaning, dahil meron kang kakayanang mag-donate, therefore, you must pay those donor's tax. Okay, another classification is what we call the classification as a burden. Okay, burden to the taxpayer. First is what we have, the taxpayers, the direct taxes. Okay, tax wherein both the incidence as well as the impact or burden of the tax faced on one person. An example of a direct tax is what we call the income tax. Okay, kasi nga direktang binabayad mo yan sa gobyerno. Direktang binabawas yan sa iyong salary. You have also the community tax, direkta din yung binabayad yan. Estate tax, direktang taxes din yan. Next is what we call the indirect taxes. Taxes wherein the incidence of or the liability for the payment of the tax falls on the one person, but the burden thereof can be shifted or passed to another person. An example of that is a VAT, percentage tax, custom duties, excise taxes on certain specific goods. Ano ba yung VAT? Paano ba umuubra ang VAT? Ganito kasi yung VAT. So for example, si manufacturer gagawa siya ng isang produkto. Siyempre, yung produktong gagawin niya, okay, kailangan niyang magbayad ng VAT. Kunyari, bibili siya ng raw materials. Kung bibili siya ng raw materials, yung purchase price ng raw materials na nagbebenta sa kanya ng supplier niya, ilalagyan nyo ng VAT. Meaning 12% na mas mataas yung babayaran niyang amount doon sa raw material. Okay. Sabihin natin si manufacturer gumawa siya ng lata ng sardinas or sardinas, let's say. Meron siyang cannery. Okay, gawa ng manufacturer ng sardinas. Ngayon, yung sardinas na yon, okay, ibebenta niya, dinagbayad na siya ng 12% VAT doon sa materialis na yon. Kung ibebenta niya ngayon yon, okay, kung ibebenta niya ngayon yung produkto na yon, okay, that product will be sold to the distributor. The distributor will buy that product and the manufacturer will add 12% VAT on that. Magdadagdag siya ng 12% na VAT. Okay? So that 12% VAT, okay, madadagdag yon doon sa pagbenta niya sa distributor. Ngayon si distributor, dahil na-charge siya ng VAT, okay, pag ibebenta niya yun sa retailer, dadagdagan niya ulit ng 12% VAT yon. Okay? Then that retailer, okay, pag ibebenta niya yon sa final consumer, may 12% VAT yon. Okay? And every stage of the way, nire-report yon ni manufacturer, distributor, and retailer doon sa BIR. Dinideclare nila yan monthly kung magkano yung VAT na binabayaran nila at magkano yung VAT na sinisingil nila doon sa kanilang pinagbentahan ng produkto. So therefore, meaning that VAT will fall basically directly to the final consumer. At yung final consumer, siya talaga ang nagbayad ng full burden of that 12% VAT of that product. Okay? So ang VAT, hindi lang yan doon sa private consumer, but it is also for the, it is not only for the final consumer, but it is also for the manufacturers proportionately. Ano ba? Yeah. Okay. So important points to consider regarding the indirect taxes. Okay? When the consumer or the end user of the manufactured product is tax exempt, such exemption covers only those taxes for which such consumer or end user is directly liable. Indirect taxes are not included. Hence, the manufacturer cannot claim exception from the payment of sales tax, neither can the consumer or buyer of the product demands the refund of the tax that the manufacturer might have passed on him. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, although, let's say, if you are exempted to pay taxes, okay, there are certain companies that are exempted to pay taxes, hindi mo pwedeng ipasa. Kung ikaw ay exempted at nagbayad ka ng VAT, hindi mo pwedeng ipasa yung VAT sa ibang tao. Okay? And that is what is being explained here with regards to the direct taxes. Next. Okay. When the transaction itself is the one that is tax exempt, but through error, the seller pays the tax and ship the same to the buyer, the seller gets the refund but must hold it in trust for the buyer. Okay? So ito yung sinasabi natin na pag nagkamali siya, kailangan niya lang kapitan yun for the buyer. Next, when tax exemption from indirect taxes is given to a contractee, okay, but the evident intention is to accept the contractor so that such contractor may no longer ship or pass any of the tax to the contractee. The contractor may claim the tax exemption on the transaction, and that is in accordance to the CIR Commissioner on Internal Revenue versus Jan Gotamgo. Next is when the law granting tax exemption specifically includes direct taxes or indirect taxes, or when it is clear manifested therein that legislative intention to accept embraces indirect taxes, then the buyer of the product or service sold has a right to be reimbursed the amount of the taxes that the seller passes on him. Okay, so another classification and distinction is as to purpose. Again, general fiscal revenue. So tax imposition for the general purpose of the government, i.e. raise revenue for the governmental needs. Okay, an example of that is the income tax, VAT, and almost all taxes that we are paying is for the general and fiscal and revenue purposes of the government, for them to fund the needs that they are providing to our citizens. Then we also have the special or regulatory taxes. So tax imposed for special purposes, i.e. to achieve some social or economic needs. So an example of that is the educational fund tax. Sorry, nagko-collapse yung Nagko-collapse yung internet ko. Wait lang ah. Nawawala ako sa shares in advance proportion. Okay. Okay. So another kind of tax is for the purpose, as to its purpose, and it is a special or regulatory kind of tax. Tax imposed for special purpose, i.e., to achieve some social or economic needs. Example of that is the educational fund under the real property taxation. So basically, yung mga binabayaran nating amilyar, it goes to the educational fund taxation, educational funds tax. So doon niya siya inukuha. So yung pondo na binabayad sa inyo o yung pondo na pambayad sa mga state universities, galing yun sa real property taxation. Another example is the sin tax. Yung sin tax na binabayad ng mga naninigarilyo, nagiinom ng alak, yung buwis na binabayad, additional na binabayad sa sigarilyo, alak, at kung ano-ano pa man, yan ay napupunta sa universal health care. Meaning, yan ay napupunta dun sa pondo ng PhilHealth. Okay? Bukod doon sa contribution na binabayaran ng mga trabahante. Okay, next is as to measure of application. So we have specific taxation. Okay, tax imposed per head, unit, or number, or by some standard of weight or measure in which requires no assessment beyond a listing and classification of the subject to be taxed. An example of that is taxes on distilled spirits, wine, and fermented liquors. Okay, another specific tax is yung sin tax with regards dun sa sigarilyo per pack ang bayad, right? Then we have what we call the ad valorem tax, tax based on the value of the article or things subject to tax. An example of that is the real property taxes or custom duty. Ibig sabihin, yung tax ay nakabase hindi dun sa per piraso, but nakabase siya dun sa value nung ari-arian na tinatax. Right? Next. We have what we call the classification as per date. Progressive taxation, the rate of the amount of the tax increases as the amount of income or earnings based or tax based to be increased. So example of this progressive taxation is the income tax, the estate tax, or the donor's tax. Meaning, mas malaki ang value ng iyong income, mas malaki ang value ng iyong estate, mas malaki ang value ng dinonate sa'yo, that is, the tax also increases. Then we have what we call the regressive tax. The tax rate decreases as the amount of income or earning or tax base to be taxed is increased. Okay, so wala tayong ganyan dito sa Pilipinas. Okay, regressive tax, ibig sabihin, pag lumalaki yung income mo, bumababa yung tax mo. Wala tayo yan dito sa Pilipinas. Kasi nga, ang ating tax system is progressive and not regressive. So habang lumalaki ang iyong income, lumalaki rin ang iyong tax na babayaran. Okay? Next. Okay. So next is what we have, the classification of taxes as to date. We also have a mixed tax or tax rate are partly progressive and partly regressive. We also have what we call a proportionate tax. Tax rates are fixed on a flat tax base. Example of that is real estate tax, which is 6%. We also have the VAT, which is 12%. And we also have other taxes such as the percentage tax of 8%. Okay, next, we also have what we call as to scope or authority imposing the tax. Sino yung nagpapatupad ng taxation? So number one, we have the national tax. Tax imposed by the national government, which is national internal revenue taxes, custom duties. So ibig sabihin national government ang nag-i-impose niyan at national government din ang naniningil niyan. Then we have the municipal local taxation, the tax imposed by the local government unit. Example is the real estate tax o yung mga amilyar na binabayaran natin, yung tinatawag nating sedula, right? Yan, sinisingil yan ng ating mga city or ating mga municipality. Professional taxes o yung PTR, professional tax receipt, PTR. So yan, binabayad mo yan doon sa iyong locality or doon sa iyong city or municipality. Another example is what you call the amusement tax. Yan. So pag nanonood ka ng sine, tignan mo yung resibo mo, nakalagay doon may amusement tax. Yung amusement tax na po na yan ay sinusurrender ng mga sinihan sa local government. Pati yung mga beer house, may amusement tax din yun. Ewan ko lang kung nagre-remit sila ng tamang tax dun sa mga beer house at sa mga bar. Especially dun sa nagtitinda ng mga alak. Next. Regressive system of taxation vis-a-vis regressive taxation. A regressive taxation must not be confused with regressive system of taxation. Okay. Iba yung regressive tax. Ang sinasabi sa regressive tax is the tax rate of which decreases as the tax base increases. Regressive taxation, habang lumalaki yung income mo, lumiliit yung binabayaran mong tax. Yun yung regressive taxation or regressive tax. Pero yung regressive system of taxation focuses on the indirect taxes. It exists when there are more indirect taxes imposed than direct taxation. Okay, but on our case, we are on a progressive taxation kasi mas maraming direct taxation than indirect taxation. Okay. Now let's have a comparison. Okay, so another tax distinguished from other impositions. So we have what we call the tax versus tolls. Okay, so toll is the sum of money for the use of something generally applied to the consideration which is paid for the use of roads, bridges, of the like, and of a public nature. Okay, so toll ang tawag doon, hindi tax. So kung dadaan ka sa NLEX, dadaan ka sa SLEX, dadaan ka sa Star Toll, so ang hindi yung tax. Ang tawag doon ay toll. Okay? And what is the difference? So one is demand of sovereignty. Ang nagde-demand sa tax ay ang gobyerno. When you say toll, it demands of proprietorship. Meaning kung sino yung gumawa ng bridges, roads, so sila yung nagde-demand nun. Paid for the support of the government for tax, and toll paid for the use of another property. Generally, no limit as to the amount imposed for taxes, while on toll, amount depends on the cost of the construction or maintenance of the public improvement used. And lastly, for taxes, imposed only by the government, while on toll, imposed by the government or private individual or entity. Okay, so those are the difference. Please take note of the difference of tax and toll. Okay, next. Tax versus penalty. Okay, penalty, okay, any sanction imposed as a punishment for the violation of law or acts deemed injurious not only to the government but also to a third person. So in taxation or in tax, generally, it is intended to raise funds, while in penalty, it is designed to regulate a certain conduct. Okay, for tax, it imposes only by the government, but for penalty, paid for use of another's property. Next. We also have tax. So we also have tax versus special assessment. So special assessment is an enforced proportional contribution from owners of land, especially or particularly benefited by the public improvement. So for taxes, it is imposed to persons, property, and excises, personal liability of the person assessed, based on necessity as well as on the benefit received. And we also have generally applicable, and just see later I will show you apostolic perfect versus treasury of Baguio. And for special assessment, levied only on lands, not a personal liability of the person assessed. His liability is limited only to the land, based fully on the benefit, and exceptionally both as time and as to its place. Okay, so another important points to consider with regards to special assessment, since special assessments are not taxes within the constitutional or statutory provision on tax exemption, it follows that the exception under Section 28, paragraph 3 of Article 6 of the Constitution does not apply to special assessment. However, in view of the exempting proviso in the Section 234 of the Local Government Code, properties which are actually directly and exclusively used for religious, charitable, and educational purposes are not exactly exempted from real property tax, but are exempted from the imposition of the special assessment as well. Okay, and lastly, okay, the general rule is that exception from taxation does not include exception for special assessment. Okay?